Hey everyone, it's week 14. I don't want to delay us any further, so we're going to dive right in here. We're looking at the art and architecture of the early Middle Ages. So I'm going to dive into the early Middle Ages. We're specifically speaking of the 6th through the 10th century. That's when historians sort of divide off the early Middle Ages. So in the fractured West, during the early Middle Ages, the various kingdoms, cultures, cross-culturals, the brief Carolingian Empire, and the triumph of Christianity all led to a wide variety of artistic styles that are happening during this particular period of time. Now, in the West, still, most art is, and architecture for that matter, is focused on religious concerns. The visual art of the time was dominated by the illuminated manuscript. I've got that highlighted. These were richly decorated books with brilliant colors and gold leaf that were usually of sacred writings. They were done by scribes in monasteries and abbeys, and these could be both men and women. The architecture of the time, for a good 200 years, there really was no large-scale construction that we saw in the West as it was sort of recovering from the fall of the Roman Empire. But then, as stability and peace began to settle, you have Pope Hadrian I and Leo III, who launched ambitious church construction projects throughout Italy and Western Europe as well. And it's during this time, well, that's actually a bit later, as we get into the Carolingian Empire, that the basilica design is further innovated with the addition of the Carolingian westwork. This is a tall, multi-storied structure on the western end of a church that would often be flanked by towers. So when we look at the art of this period, as I was saying earlier, what we end up seeing is a mixture of cultural influences on the art. This is a chalice, the Alda chalice, from Ireland. It would have been produced somewhere circa 800. And when we look at this, it is, of course, Christian. It would have been used in religious services as the chalice for communion. Right? But when we look at it, we see elements of prehistoric European cultural influence. We see, when we look at this, very Celtic. The Celts were a culture from Ireland. We see a lot of Celtic influence in the decoration, the ornamentation of it. We also see some Roman influence. We see some influence from Byzantium with all of that gold leaf that's on there. And this is something that occurs all throughout Europe at the time, where cultures are, again, recovering from the fall of the Roman Empire. No one culture really asserts itself, right? We've got lots of influences, multicultural influences blending into a nice mixture. So let's take a look at the illuminated manuscripts. We'll take a look specifically at the Codex Amiatinus and the Book of the Kells. We'll look at, I should have deleted the Beatus Apocalypse. A codex, that term, what does that mean precisely? Well, a codex is what you're looking at right here. This is the Codex Amiatinus. In the Middle Ages, particularly in the early Middle Ages, we don't yet have printed books in Europe the way we understand them now. Instead, we had, within monasteries and abbeys, monks and nuns who were trained and literate to write and illustrate, to make these collections of pages that, once bound together into a folio, was referred to as a codex. Codex is Latin, a Latin term for the trunk of a tree, because look at it. You had that much paper put together into this big, gigantic folio of pages. A lot of wood pulp went into making that, so almost tongue-in-cheek, it gets referred to as the trunk of a tree. Now, as I mentioned, you would have had groups of scribes, and these could have been nuns, these could have been monks, they could be men or women, who would have been cloistered in their monasteries or abbeys, and their job was to essentially copy a written work that was given to them. They would be in charge of, any particular monk or nun would be in charge of very specific pages in the book. It would be overseen by the abbess. She would be the head mistress, the head nun of an abbey, or the head monk, who would be in charge of either a new book that was being newly written, or the copying of an old book, whether that be a copy of one of the books of the Bible, or whether that be a copy of something that has been written about the Bible, or some other sort of religious sacred text. that may have nothing to do with the Bible, but would have been a sacred text to the Catholic Church. And the head nun, the head monk would have decided, our monastery, our abbey is going to produce a copy of this book or this new book, what have you, and would assign to each of the nuns or monks within the group a certain number of pages. These pages are yours to copy and to illustrate. And this is an image from the Codex Amiatinus of the prophet Isaiah from the Old Testament. This would have been produced around 700. Now, this is meant to be an image of the prophet Ezra as he's writing his prophecies down. But if you look at that, that is clearly not meant to look like ancient Palestine. This is not meant to look like the Middle East in ancient times. Instead, the scribe who has made this little illuminated page here, who's drawn this illustration, is giving us a glimpse of what it would have been like to be a cloistered monk working as a scribe. This is what it looked like for the scribes. You can see our cloistered monk here, who's, with that halo, is meant to be the prophet Ezra, writing in this book, while behind him there is a cabinet full of other pages that he has either already written or will eventually reach for and continue to write in. This was the life of a cloistered monk or nun, to sit in a small little room accompanied by the pages and ink that you were using for your craft, and copying and copying and copying, as well as illustrating, to act as an agent to the words that were being scribed. And these illuminated manuscripts could become incredibly complex. Here we have a couple of pages from one of the most ornate illustrated or illuminated manuscripts that we have from the early Middle Ages, the Book of the Kells. This would have been produced in Ireland, as you see here, somewhere around 800 BC. And these are 2 pages. The one here on the left is an illuminated, illustrated Chi-Rho. And I mean, it's extremely so, right? Like the X and the P, the Chi, and the Rho have been done in an extremely ornate manner, just in and of themselves. And then look at all this ornamentation that surrounds it, right? Over here, we have an incipit of the Gospel of Matthew. An incipit was when you took the first letter of whatever you were writing, whether it be, in this case, the Gospel of Matthew that was being copied down, or if it was like a chapter of whatever book that you might be copying down. The first letter of the first word would get its own fancy illustration. And so here we have an incipit that is the first letter of whatever, in this case, the Gospel of Matthew, right? That you would then go on and read the rest of what was scribed. And again, the sheer ornate nature of it. We're using different colored inks, although the one that is most prominent in a lot of these early illuminated manuscripts is red ink. It was one that was fairly easy to produce at the time. We see lots of gold, because there would have been gold leaf that would have also been used for illustrating these. And we see influences, like I was talking, multicultural influences. We see what would be influences that are taken very much from early Celtic culture, early Celtic art, pre-Roman Celtic art. But we also are seeing, look at this face here of Mary in this Virgin and Child. Right? That is very Byzantine in nature. There's Byzantine influences here as well as some Greco-Roman influences. Right? All that's happening here. But again, just the sheer ornate nature of these. There's no holding back. These are opulent. Since we're on the subject of religious art, I want to also talk about Gregorian chant. This was a new type of hymn or chant that was originally credited to Pope Gregory I in the 7th century, hence why it's referred to as Gregorian chant. But historians now believe that it may have been, and most likely developed by Carolinian composers of the time, maybe even a little bit later, in the 8th, 9th, or even 10th centuries. Gregorian chant were songs that were written generally to be sung by monks in what is referred to as tetrachord, meaning a 4-note harmony. Would have 4 parts that would be harmonized together, and the songs are still sung in Latin. And you've heard it. It's the kind of monotonous drone. I call it monotonous, even though I really love Gregorian chant. There is sort of a very monotonous kind of tone to them, and there is that sort of intonation to Gregorian chant. And again, would have been sung by groups of monks. Often Gregorian chant fits in with the medieval fixation on one's sinfulness and need for forgiveness. We'll listen to one here, written by a man by the name Stephen of Liege, Deum Verum, from the 9th century. you may have noticed there as we got toward the end of that little clip that I played, where that tetrachord harmony really kind of kicked in. A Gregorian chant is meant to be this kind of collective prayer in song. Often, again, it is designed to either praise God, you are so holy, you are so wonderful, you are so impressively large, or to ask forgiveness, many times collective forgiveness. We are not worthy of the grace that you have bestowed upon us, that kind of a thing. That's Gregorian chant. Now, an interesting thing happens in the early Middle Ages on the Iberian Peninsula. The Iberian Peninsula is the portion of Europe now occupied by Spain and Portugal. We're going to look at that area, which during the early Middle Ages was under Islamic and Moorish rule. The Islamic invasion of the Iberian Peninsula began in 711 as the Muslim Empire, which had been conquering northern Africa, which you can sort of see a little bit up right here, crossed the Straits of Gibraltar and began conquering either through military conquest or through negotiations most of the Iberian Peninsula, which they ruled controlled for nearly 800 years. So a large span of time. A great portion of the Iberian Peninsula was Islamic. Now, some Christian enclaves survived, and the whole area sort of became a multicultural melting pot, if you will. But the greater part of the population became Muslim, or what are referred to as the Moors. And this left an indelible mark on the art and architecture of this region. When it comes to the art and architecture, we see very specific influences. When we look at art and architecture of this period and in this region, there are Greco-Roman influences being combined with Muslim influences being combined with Northern African influences, as well as Byzantine influences. We see all of this sort of getting glommed together into this style that is very identifiable as Iberian Peninsula, Moorish, Islamic art and architecture. The art of this area takes on the characteristics of Muslim art, where there are almost no human or religious representations. This is because that would have been considered idolatry to the Muslim faith. In Islam, the understanding is that only God is allowed to create from nothing. And so to draw or represent in art a human figure or to illustrate, say, scenes from the Quran, things that happen in the Quran, would have been considered idolatrous because it would have felt like placing yourself in the position of God as a creator. So instead, we have abstract elements in Islamic art. And on the Iberian Peninsula, there's no exception to that. Well, I don't know why that's popping up the way it is. For some reason, my animations are out of sync. So I'm just going to pop it all up like this. So instead, what you see are abstract elements like geometry, botany, nature. So there'll be a lot of floral elements, things that are vaguely leaf-like or vines or things of that nature. Things that can be abstracted, if you will, into almost purely formal elements. But when we take a closer look, we realize, oh yeah, I see the basis of a flower. I see the basis of a tree here, what have you. And calligraphy. Oftentimes we find Arabic script, particularly Arabic script from that represents passages from the Quran, used as compositional elements, where the script is stretched, pulled, manipulated in such a way as to make it feel very decorative. And it's only upon closer examination that we realize that we're looking at calligraphic script in Arabic. And when it comes to architecture, we're going to talk about mosques, right? And we'll look at the architectural elements of a mosque in the Middle Ages. So yeah, as I was mentioning, the Islamic Empire has a huge expansion during the Middle Ages, beginning with the early conquests of Muhammad himself and continuing on after his death. Everything that we see here in orange was at some point under Islamic control. As you can see, the Byzantine Empire has sort of been squished down as a result. Right? This is sort of pushing it inward. It's becoming smaller. But again, after having conquered this northern area of Africa, the Straits of Gibraltar, well, that's not very wide, and so it was easy enough to then cross there and begin a conquest of Spain. Now, it never quite expanded into the rest of Europe. The Moorish control pretty much stayed on the Iberian Peninsula. So we'll look at then medieval mosques and talk about the architectural elements of them. How do we recognize them? And then we'll look at some examples of how this gets translated on the Iberian Peninsula. So those architectural elements. You have the Qibla wall. Right. So now over here on this floor plan of a mosque in Tunisia that would have been built in 670, so it's contemporary to the time period that we're talking about. I have the numbers that you see over here are reflected over here. So when we talk about the Qibla wall, you have these ones here. We're talking about this wall right here. Right? This is the wall of the mosque that faces Mecca specifically. It would have, the mosque would have been situated in such a way that that particular wall would face Mecca. Mecca being a place of extreme religious, sacred nature to the Islamic faith. The mihrab, number 2, which is this little enclave right here, is the point on the mosque that is the nearest to Mecca, and congregations would have faced it when praying. So so now we have number 3, the Hippot style prayer hall. Right? And I've got 3 here and 3 here. This whole area right here that you can see with all these columns that are being represented by these dots. Right? This is a term for a roof that is supported by columns. Simply enough, the term that should say Hippot style literally means under pillars. Right? And it would have been the area for worshipers to worship. These rows of columns can then multiply indefinitely. So there wasn't like a specific number. Some mosques had a larger prayer hall, some were smaller, but they were meant, you were meant to have many, many, many columns within this space to sort of represent eternity. Right? One could be in the midst of this prayer hall and it would look like there were an infinite number of pillars all around you. Right? And again, there was no like set number that there must be. Those rows could be repeated and repeated and repeated depending on the size that was required for the region where the mosque was built. Then you're going to have domes. Right? There are a couple of specific domes. There is the entrance dome, which I have listed here as 4A. This would have been right above the entrance, marking where to come in. Right? You would have come through here and you would enter the mosque here. And then we have the mihrab dome. That would be the dome that's right here. It would be right above the mihrab. Right? You would have marked the spot at which you should face when praying. There's the nave. Right? That's something that's also included in Christian churches, the nave. It's this central corridor that comes through the prayer hall. There would have been what is referred to as a forecourt. That I have listed there as number 6. It's the courtyard in front of the mosque. This would have been an open air area. Might often have trees and gardens and places like that you would walk through on your way to worship at the mosque. Then there's the minaret, which I have listed here as number 7. The minaret would have been a tall tower used for the Muslim call to prayer. Now, many of these architectural elements are still incorporated into mosques to this day, but this specific configuration is very medieval and was the style of note, the style that was popular at the time as the conquest was happening on the Iberian Peninsula. So here we have an example. This is again the mosque of, I'm going to try it, Kairouan. I hope that I'm pronouncing that correctly. In Tunisia, that was built in 670. This is the one that we just saw the floor plan of. And you'll see, right here in front, we have the minaret. The minaret, one would have stood here to call the community to prayer. Here's our forecourt. So one would enter, walk through the forecourt here to the entrance. Above the entrance, there's the entrance dome. This whole area here would have been the prayer hall. And if we go inside, we would see all of the columns holding up that roof. Beyond that, we can see the dome here that is the mihrab dome. And below it would have been the mihrab. The wall over here would be our Qibla wall that is facing toward Mecca. But now that's in Tunisia. Tunisia is in northern Africa. In Spain, particularly in the region that would have been called Cordoba, we have the Great Mosque of Cordoba that was built in 785. Now, you may be seeing some things that are a little different from what we just looked at. We'll talk about that in a moment. But you can see that there is a minaret over here. We don't seem to have a dome over the entrance, but I'll talk about why in a moment. But back here we have a dome that would have been over the mihrab. We have the wall that would have faced Mecca. Like, what's going on right here? Because this looks very different from this, right? Our prayer hall, which is huge in this case, seems to have been interrupted by something. Well, that's because eventually the Moors were sort of pushed out of this region, and the Catholic Church sort of filled its void again. And this particular mosque was converted to a Catholic cathedral in the late Middle Ages. So there are some architectural elements here. They essentially just slapped a cathedral down in the middle of the whole thing. And you can see some architectural elements here that don't look particularly Muslim in nature. And that's because they do look very Gothic in nature. When we get to the Gothic cathedrals that we'll look at in the next lecture, I bet you'll recognize some of the things that you're seeing happening here. But I mean, like, look, it's essentially still the basilica design. It's a cross. There's one line, there's the transept that crosses it, right? But it's been plopped down right in the middle of this mosque that was converted from a mosque to Christian purposes. And this is sort of a fortress, village, town, if you will, Madinat al-Zahara, that would have been it was built up on a high hill. It would have been a place for Muslim rulers of the time to have watched over the particular land they would have been in charge of. This was built in the early 10th century, and as you can see, a lot of it is in ruins. But I wanted to come here because going inside the portions of it that still stand give us an indication of what the Iberian Islamic art style was. And you can see here, this is inside a prayer hall, or I'm sorry, the reception hall of Abd ar-Rahman III, who would have been the ruler, who would have received guests and would have held banquets and things of that nature in this area. And we can see what I was just talking about, these combinations of different cultural things coming together. We have these columns, and the capitals of these columns are very Roman in nature. The columns themselves have a kind of North African look to them. These arches that are nearly but not quite a full circle, and these sort of radiating red bands that come outward from them are very indicative of Islamic influence, as is all of the scroll work that I was talking about that is very abstract in nature. And in this particular case, it looks like leaves and vines and things of that nature. And this is indicative of a lot of the art that we find on the walls of buildings that would have been built by the Moors of the time. They're extremely ornate, extremely decorative, but they're abstract. We don't find representations of humans very often. We don't find, as we often do in Christian art, representations or illustrations of scenes that happen in the Quran. Instead, we get these elements that are meant to look very floral or botanical in nature. Or we get bits of artwork that use Arabic calligraphy, as this piece does, to form a decorative kind of scroll, a decorative line, decorative shapes that become abstract. Or sometimes we get images that have both, right? We have in here, we have elements down here that are very much botanical in nature, and we have elements that are calligraphic in nature. Right? These swirls of the Arabic writing here that have larger swoops than one might normally see in writing, right? To create something decorative. That's all very Islamic in nature. Now, this had its influence on Christian art as well in the region, because again, it's not as if the Christians went away, right? And even long after the Muslims and the Moors were gone from the region, that influence, really even to this day, affects a lot of the art and architecture that we see in Spain and in Portugal. In this case, we have an illuminated manuscript titled the Herona Beatus. It was a 10th century illuminated manuscript that illustrated and commented upon the book of Revelation. So it was a copy that the scribes would have put down of the book of Revelation from the New Testament, but also would have had notes that were commentary on it, that would have been commentary of the head monk, the head nun, whomever that edited this particular book. And it would have contained illustrations by those scribes as well. What is of particular interest about this one is that this manuscript, while being Christian in origin, is heavily influenced by Islamic art styles because it was produced during the Islamic conquest of, or the Islamic control of the Iberian Peninsula. This book was produced in Spain, this codex. And secondly, it is interesting because we have a signed illuminator by the name of Ende, or aka Depintrix, which would have been Latin for paintress, a woman who paints. She would have been a nun. She got to sign her name to this, and we have an idea of which of some of the illustrations within it are hers, because the illustrations within the book show different styles that no doubt denote different hands of different illustrators making them. We have this one that is thought to perhaps be hers. It says here the Beatus Apocalypse of Herona Prona Beatus. The terms for these things are kind of all over the place. No one ever seems to agree what something should be called. We're still talking about the same codex. This one is believed to have been illustrated by her. This particular page would have been one that she was responsible for. At least that's what some art historians believe to be the case. And we see this illustration, which again shows Byzantine influences, shows some influence of what's happening in the or by the scribes who are doing illuminated manuscripts throughout the rest of Western Europe. But there's also a great deal of Islamic influence. Now, in the Islamic art of the time, we would not have seen this illustration of this person riding a horse. We wouldn't have gotten such an overt illustration of an event that's happening, because that would have seemed sacrilegious. It would have been it just wouldn't have been cool, because that would have been placing yourself in the place of God. It would have been idolatry to do something like that. But notice just how similar what we see happening in the illustration of this tree, just how similar that language, that visual language, is to the visual language that we see on the walls of mosques from this time, right? They're using plant motifs, natural motifs, but twisting and pulling them into ways that are very abstract in nature, very linear, breaking them down into shape, line, and repeated motifs that can become oftentimes symmetrical, or if not symmetrical, at least repeating in such a way as they feel like they're repeating on into infinity. And we see very similar things happening within the way that this tree is represented. It's represented first as an abstract circle, then there's sort of these twisty vines that sort of make up its trunk. These lines are sort of abstract representations of branches. The leaves on the outside are essentially just shapes that allude to leaves. That's all a very Islamic influence on what is a Christian illuminated manuscript. So let's look very quickly at one particular architectural element that comes into play when we talk about Christian architecture of the early Middle Ages. We'll look particularly at the monastic Basilica of Corvey as an example of this new thing that is brought in by the Carolinians of the Westwork. Right, so the Westwork. Essentially, the Carolinians take the basilica design that you are already well familiar with from our lectures on late antiquity and make it into something that looks a lot more similar to how we think of churches and cathedrals now. By taking a basilica, which is all this back here, and on the front of it, slapping on a new facade. And that new facade gets called the Westwork because it would have been on the western end of the cathedral, or the basilica, and it would have been a tall, multi-storied structure placed on the western end of a church that was often flanked by towers. Now, if you attend a Christian church, whether it be a cathedral or just a Protestant back, in the country kind of church, if your church has a place where you enter in, and there's sort of a vestibule area, or some churches may call it the narthex, there is an area, right, where you first walk in that is not the sanctuary. It is not the place of worship. You walk in and it's a transition area. You walk through it and then you enter into another door that then takes you into the sanctuary, which is the place that you plan to worship. You have the Carolinians to thank for that. They're the ones who stuck this extra bit on the front, which contains that kind of lobby area, if you will. The narthex is what it was referred to by the Carolinians, and this is why a lot of churches now still refer to it as the narthex. And there would have been these towers on either side. These were places to install bells. This would have been kind of the Christian equivalent of that Islamic minaret. But rather than a person standing up there and calling out the people as a call to prayer, bells would have been wrong, because a cathedral, I keep trying to call it a cathedral because it looks like one, but we haven't yet transitioned into cathedrals. These basilicas would have been in the center of a village or a town, and the bells would ring to let people know, hey, it is time to get yourself to church so that you can worship. And one of the earliest surviving examples that we have here is the monastic basilica of Corvey. This is the Westwork of that basilica that would have been built in, between 1883 and 1885. Right? Where again, the front of this starts to look a little more like something you might identify as a church or a cathedral. Right? It's not there yet. It's not completely there, right? But it certainly is breaking away from its Roman basilica models. Right? It is a multi-storied facade, right? This middle portion here, with a narthex here. There might be like offices for the priest and monks and things of that nature that would have also been in these upper stories. And then two towers on either side. Both, in this case, both are capped with spires, and these would have contained bells. They would have been bell towers for calling worshipers to come to the church. Go around on the other side of the church, right, or the basilica. There's one of those towers we were just looking at. It would be this tower right here. We come around back here, and it's a basilica. No doubt about it, we are looking at a basilica. It has the cruciform design to it. It has the nave. It has the apse down here at the end. It's a Roman basilica. There's maybe a little extra ornamentation that's happened with the spire in the middle. This is beginning to be suggestive of what's going to happen with the cathedrals that are going to come after it. But what was of particular importance as far as what we're talking about is the Carolingian Empire's contribution of the westwork that was put on the front of the basilica, making the basilica look a little more like the cathedral that is going to come very soon. That, I believe, yep, that is it. That is all I have for the early Middle Ages. Keep in mind that we do not have a quiz this week. Your quiz will actually be next week. Next week, we'll look at the High Middle Ages, not so much the Late Middle Ages, but the High Middle Ages, where much of what we just saw is going to continue, but we're going to make advancements in a lot of this stuff. All right, take care, everyone. Bye.